Thank you all for coming. A special welcome to our non-member guests this evening. And I'm going to talk about trickery and deception in animals and plants. And I do have a few slides on disease-causing microorganisms. They are part of the natural world, and some of the tricks they have up their sleeves that affect human health and animal health in general. I have 26 slides, and they're all numbered down there. I do have a couple more in supplementary slides. If questions come up or if we have time, I'd like to show them. On this title slide, the 3 insects, and all 3 of these are found locally. This is a cuckoo wasp that was on my front porch. This and this, the eastern amberwing, which is a small dragonfly, and the viceroy butterfly were both I saw in tall pines. And each of these, we'll come to later, is an example of some sort of a deceit or trickery. So just to put deception into perspective, why do animals engage in deception? The first thing that comes to mind is survival, but with the qualification that survival at least until reproduction. Otherwise, it's a dead end for the genes. And part of survival is finding food, avoiding predators, finding a mate, ensuring survival of offspring. So I'll come to the behavior of the killdeer later, but that's an example of a parent that's putting its own survival at risk in protecting its young. This makes sense if we believe that in evolution the main thing is passing on of genes, and these offspring have the parents' genes. So this is driven by evolution, meaning that the tricks and deceits that are beneficial towards these will be selected for, and the genes for these traits will be passed on. I'm going to leave you with this question for the rest of this presentation and come back to it at the end. Whatever no means in this context. Okay? Well, I will return to it at the very end. So here are a few examples, starting to look at examples. On the left is a kind of camouflage called masquerade, in which the animal looks like something inedible. This is a bird dropping spider. It looks like bird dropping. Here is a leaf insect. It looks like a dried leaf, which is not very edible. But here's the interesting thing. It moves as though it's swaying in the wind. And so that's an example of motion camouflage. So, and this is quite common in the same animal. You have both masquerade and motion camouflage. This is the kind of thing that we're most familiar with, background matching. This is a crab spider, a yellow crab spider on a yellow flower. The crab spider can change colors, but its repertoire is very limited. Just white if it's on a white flower, and yellow. And the first several slides, half a dozen slides, are going to have the theme of animals being able to change their color. On the top here is the caterpillar of the peppered moth. And it can change its color depending on its background. And here's the amazing thing. This caterpillar, in this study, they actually blindfolded it. And in spite of that, it was able to change the color to match the substrate. And it turns out that it has cells on its body that has some of the same proteins that its eye has, which senses the color. Now, in the middle here is also a peppered moth caterpillar. It's engaging in masquerade, looking like a twig, inedible. So moving on, the octopus is a champion of color change. Not only can it change color, it can also change its texture. And would you like to see an octopus changing color? Yeah. Okay. Here's a pink octopus. It's going to become yellow. However, unlike what this model suggests, the octopus doesn't turn itself inside out to change color. Instead, it has these structures on its surface called chromatophores, which are filled with pigment, and it's able to shrink or expand the size of those chromatophores and is able to change color. Cephalopods have other tricks. We all know about shooting ink. Danger coloration is something that will come up again. It's the property of having certain colors or combinations of colors or patterns that tell a predator to alert it that I'm dangerous. Don't eat me. I'm toxic, or I'm in some other way that I can be a danger to you. And we'll come back again to danger coloration. Shooting ink, of course, we all know about. Counter illumination is very interesting. We know about counter shading. In this firefly squid, on the underside of it, it bioluminesces. So when a predator is looking up at it from below against the bright of the surface of the sea, brightness of the surface of the sea, this counter illumination helps it be less visible. Now, this is not the only animal that has counter illumination. So, picking these examples might give you the impression that some of these things are not common, but that's not the case. In fact, it's more the norm than the exception that an animal will engage in some kind of deceptive or tricky behavior. Okay, so now this is an interesting story of a fish called a fang blenny. It's a funny name. It's a small fish, but actually does have little fangs. So this is a cleaner fish called a wrasse, and this is a larger fish, which is its client. And here's what this means. There are cleaning stations, say, within the coral reef, where these client fish will come, and these cleaner fish will eat the ectoparasites off the skin of the client fish. What the fang blenny does is that it changes its appearance to look like the cleaner fish. It takes its place at cleaner stations, and instead of picking off the parasites, it will eat, feeds on the skin, scales, and mucus of the client fish. So the fang blenny is able to change its appearance. Again, its repertoire is a little limited, but depending on what deception it wants to carry out, it can change its appearance. Here's a color change story, albeit on an evolutionary timescale. However, on a very limited evolutionary timescale of the order of a century or two. Some of you may have heard of this peppered moth story. So the peppered moth likes to rest on lichen, on tree bark, and on tree surfaces. And before the industrial revolution in the UK, peppered moths looked like this. When the Industrial Revolution was going strong, the surfaces that the peppered moth liked to sit on were covered with soot. And so gradually, and the birds were able to pick off this white form, which stood out against the darker background, which had become dark because of the soot. And gradually, this form was replaced by a darker form. And not only that, when air pollution controls were introduced, these declined and these came back. Now, this is within a space of a couple of hundred years. Now, this gentleman who did these studies and made this proposal came under a lot of criticism, and people thought he'd made stuff up, all that kind of thing. And some of them were creationists. They didn't like this pat story of evolution. But many decades later, Kettlewell was vindicated, his studies were repeated, and his conclusions held up. Now, when we think of camouflage or background matching, we typically think of animals. Here's a plant that grows in the mountains in China, and its bulbs are used in traditional medicine. And this plant was over-harvested for the bulbs. What happened gradually, over decades, is that this visible yellow-green form of that plant was actually replaced by a more camouflaged, dark form of the plant, which blended in well with the background. So here humans have caused the evolution of this plant to go from something visible to less visible. And in the paper in which this was reported, the experimenters enrolled some human subjects and actually timed them to go out in the field and look for this form and this form. And as you might expect, it took them longer to find these than to find those. Again, this is a shortened evolutionary time scale. So color change. So the octopus can change its color in less than a second. Chameleon, the order of a second or so. This gray tree frog can change also within seconds. The fang blenny that I just talked about will change its color in about 30 minutes. Crab spiders, shore crabs, roughly a week or so. Peppered moth caterpillar, which I showed on an earlier slide, not the peppered moth itself, but its caterpillar will change in weeks. And of course, these birds and these other animals change seasonally. And they're different, changing color in and of itself is quite a trick, but there's several reasons. It's not only background matching camouflage. That's one of the big ones, but there are other reasons why these animals will change color. And there are many other examples, and it would seem that this ability to change color is not all that unusual. So this color change can be driven by some kind of neuronal signal, some kind of a nervous system, or driven by hormones. And as I mentioned, in the case of the peppered moth caterpillar, the trigger was not an ocular, but an extraocular input. So of course I haven't included the peppered moth or that plant, which is actually a change in the genes, because it's an evolutionary process. Now, sound-based camouflage. And I think if you read that blob for the program, it said that visual camouflage was not the only type of camouflage. Other senses can be fooled too in deception and trickery. Here are some sound-based tricks. Lactating female whales make fewer calls at a lower volume to elude predators such as killer whales, and they prefer to stay near the shore to prevent their calls from being transmitted long distance. Here is a moth on the left. I don't recall which moth it is, but here's a magnification of the scales on its wings. And what's amazing is that in this particular moth and a few other moths, not all moths, the structure, the scales on its wings, actually absorb the ultrasound that a bat emits. So rather than reflecting off and being visible to the bat, so-called visible, this moth will not be seen, will not be detected by a bat. So that's a type of a sound-based camouflage. Here is a very interesting example. On the top here is the Alcon blue butterfly. Now, it lays its eggs, and when the caterpillar hatches, the caterpillar feeds on the plant and then falls off. When it falls to the ground, an ant or ants will carry it to their nest and look after it as though it were one of its own. And it accomplishes this in two ways. It uses smell camouflage, chemical camouflage. It smells like one of the ants. And the other thing it uses is acoustic camouflage. It makes a tiny chittering kind of sound, which sounds just like the queen. And this is not unusual behavior. It's not just this caterpillar that does that. Ants communicate mainly with chemicals, and it's easy to fool them with different chemicals or the same smelling chemicals. Here's another sound-based deception, which is quite interesting. This bird here, the fork-tailed drongo in Africa, can mimic the alarm calls of the meerkat or the starling or this babbler, and we can see how closely it mimics, this is a spectrogram, how closely it mimics the alarm calls of these animals. What happens is that the animals then run for shelter, run for safety, drop their food, and this drongo then snaps up the food. This, I must say, is pretty unique. I haven't come across any other examples of this. But one interesting thing about this deception as well as the fang blenny is that the success of those deceptions are frequency dependent. And what that means is this: if every single time the drongo made a false alarm, these animals would realize that they're being fooled and start to ignore those drongo calls. So every once in a while, the drongo has to put in a real alarm call, just to mix things up a little bit. The same with the fang blenny. Every once in a while, it'll take real bites of the parasites. And I forgot to mention, the fang blenny has an additional trick. It actually injects an opioid when it takes a bite. That's an additional trick. And we don't really know why, but we can guess that it's to prevent the cleaner fish from feeling the bite, and thus they're, more likely to come back. So one trick upon another. That's the theme. So brood parasitism, which is a fancy way of describing what a brown-headed cowbird does, as I think you all know, lays its eggs in other birds' nests. And the cowbird is familiar to us because we see it here in New Jersey, but there are many species of birds that do this. And here is a robin feeding a hatchling, a cuckoo hatchling. In spite of its much larger size, it will still feed it. Now, I came across this kind of cute cartoon on Facebook. Presumably, these red-winged blackbirds are the hosts, and the brown-headed cowbird has laid an egg in their nest. And here's making casual conversation. So, how are the kids? In reality, we don't know. We don't really know whether the cowbird cares what happens to the egg or the hatchling once it's laid it in the other bird's nest. This is the blue-green, metallic bluish-green cuckoo I mentioned on the very first slide. And it's not the only cuckoo wasp, and it's not not the only type of insects that lay their eggs in other insects' nests. So here's a kind of a mix of different subterfuges. Playing possum, that is a real thing. If a possum feels threatened by a predator, it will just drop dead. Now, there's some really fancy explanations in the literature for why this works, but I think it's just a startle factor. The predator is spooked. Here, this thing is alive, and the next second it's dead. It's just very startled. Here's a snake doing the same thing. And I'm sure you've all heard of this, shedding a body part when threatened. Same kind of thing, spook the predator. This is a killdeer. How many of you have seen the killdeer broken wing? Okay, many of you. So the killdeer likes to make its nest, say, on the edge of a parking lot amongst the rubble and the grass. And when it sees a threat to its nest, it will move a little distance away, pretend that it has a broken wing, and make a very raucous sound. It's distracting the potential predator away from its nest. Okay, and again, I don't think the killdeer is the only bird that does this. There are many. So motion camouflage, this one is a little bit difficult to explain, but I'll try. dragonflies and hoverflies are believed to use motion camouflage in this sense. This arc here is the motion of the predator, of the dragonfly, and this motion here is the arc of its prey. The dragonfly moves in such a way that there's a straight line at all times between the prey, the line of sight of the prey, the dragonfly, and some fixed point, some arbitrary fixed point. And what effect this has is that this prey will not detect any movement of the hoverfly or the dragonfly. It doesn't seem to be moving. At best, it will seem to be looming, but that's not scary enough. But it doesn't seem to be moving relative to the prey. Now, this looks like some nice, mathematical structure, and mathematicians have a lot of fun with this. But somebody actually videotaped dragonflies above a pond, and they found that about 50% of them engaged in this type of motion camouflage. When I was looking for this on the internet, I came across some blogs, some motorcyclists' blogs, and there the discussion was around how to avoid motion camouflage when you're on your motorcycle, so that it's easier for vehicles and other drivers to be able to see you better. This is called a dazzle effect, and the coloration of the pattern of the zebras are such that when they're moving, the predator has a hard time deciding how fast they're moving and in which direction they're moving. This is called the dazzle effect, or the razzle-dazzle effect. In World War I, some Allied ships were painted like this because they believed that, the enemy looking out through the periscopes would be difficult for them to judge where the ship is going or how fast it's moving. Whether this actually worked or not, I don't know, but it was something that they tried. This is not motion camouflage, but I have it here because we're on the topic of zebras. This type of coloration, when they're moving, produces a dazzle effect. When they're stationary, it's called disruptive coloration. Here, the predator has a difficult time knowing the outline of any individual animal. It's called disruptive coloration. And we've already seen the leaf insect. Actually, even stick insects do the same thing. They have a swaying motion. So coming to mimicry, so this is a classical, I'm first describing the very classical kind of mimicry in which a relatively harmless species like this amber-winged dragonfly, it's only half an inch. I'm sorry, these are not very clear photos. They're on my phone camera, but they were good enough to get decent IDs from Seek and from iNaturalist. And this is the amberwing, which has a banded abdomen. And when it's sitting, it wiggles its abdomen. It's actually a wasp mimic. Of itself, it's pretty harmless. So this is one kind of mimicry where something like this that is harmless is mimicking something that is not harmless. So here's a different kind of mimicry. The viceroy. This is a viceroy. When I posted this on our Facebook site, this I saw at Tall Pines. Chris told me that she had seen viceroys in that same spot in Tall Pines close to the lake. And it's got a distinctive line across its one of its hind wings that distinguishes it from a monarch. And so the viceroy is not necessarily toxic, but at least in one part of its range, it tastes bitter because its caterpillar feeds on willow, and it picks up something called salicylic acid, which is related to aspirin, which is bitter. But maybe in other parts of its range, it may pick up something else from what it eats. So it is unpleasant, and so is the monarch that it's mimicking, because the monarch sequesters toxins from the milkweed plant, which it uses to defend itself against predators, but as a result, it's toxic. So in this case, both the mimic and the mimicked are unpleasant in some way. So the benefit actually is to both of them, because that danger signal is amplified. It's doubled or increased by whatever factor. If a predator finds out that this viceroy is unpalatable, that will translate to the monarch as well. So they both benefit. In this case, only this is the beneficiary. So these are, as I mentioned, are classical kinds of mimicry, visual mimicry. There are many others. We've already seen some of them. One interesting one is a burrowing owl, which can give off a hiss when it senses a predator, kind of like a rattlesnake. Now I'm going to talk about luring. This is a snapping turtle. This is an example of lingual luring, lingual meaning having to do with the tongue. And it wiggles its tongue like a worm to attract fish. Think it's a tasty worm. And of course, then the snapping turtle will snap it up. Here's an anglerfish. It has a lure hanging out the top of its head, and fish are attracted to this, and of course the anglerfish will eat them. I mentioned early on that the firefly squid has bioluminescence. It makes its own bioluminescence. This lure here of the anglerfish glows, but it's due to symbiotic bacteria that live there that produces bioluminescence. Here's an example of chemical luring, and this example is from Marie, who's an orchid expert. This bee orchid resembles a female bee and also releases a hormone, a sex hormone that attracts the male, and so it's looking for pollinators. It's looking for pollinators. And here are a couple more examples of chemical luring. This is a carrion flower which smells of rotting flesh, and it attracts pollinators like flies. The pitcher plant and the Venus flytrap, I'm sure you've heard of these. These are not attracting pollinators, they're attracting prey. They're attracting insects that they then digest. And they're also emitting odors that attract these insects in one way or another. Okay, so chemical camouflage. We read a book here in this group a year or two ago by Ed Yong called An Immense World. And I was struck by this one example that he had in that book. And he said the puff adder is chemically camouflaged. It smells no different than its environment. And even animals with keen sense of smell, like a dog or a meerkat, will not be able to detect it. We've already seen chemical camouflage in that Alcon blue caterpillar of the Alcon blue butterfly. It smells like the ants, so they think it's one of them. These two insects here, this one tree hopper and this caterpillar, this also is showing masquerade kind of camouflage. They both incorporate odorous chemicals from the leaves that they're eating, and they incorporate them so that they don't smell any different than their background. So I'm going to talk about toxins in the next few slides. Because this is a huge subject, I've had to be kind of selective very arbitrarily selective in what I show. So I'm going to talk about toxins and not venoms. It's just an arbitrary thing. And first, I'll talk about animals that make their own toxins, and then I'll go on to talk about animals that sequester their toxins from an external source. This is a bombardier beetle, and if it's threatened, it releases sprays a chemical. And it actually can change the direction in which it sprays. Now this has a little chemical lab inside of it. There are two compartments with chemicals. And when it's ready to spray, the contents of the two containers mix, and they produce this noxious chemical. Not only that, the heat is produced in that reaction. And so the spray is not only noxious, it's also hot. Here's a cane toad. It makes its own poison. And in some parts of the world, I think in many parts of Australia, it's highly invasive. Look at this quote from BBC Wildlife magazine. It's one of the most destructive and deadly animals on earth. Meet the highly toxic Toadzilla. Now this was an interesting article also in BBC Wildlife. In Australia, or a certain part of Australia, crocodiles were dying off from eating these toxic cane toads. So what researchers did was they took some dead cane toads, took out the toxin, instead injected them with a nausea-inducing chemical, and baited the crocodiles with these. And because they induced nausea, the crocodiles very soon learned to stop eating cane toads. Of course, it saved some crocodiles, but it also had the result of saving some cane toads. I don't know if that was a desirable outcome or not, but here's something very ironic. Because of human intervention, the cane toad, because of its toxin, was protected. Okay, so ants. Many species of ants make formic acid, which is a somewhat noxious chemical. And this is a paper from 1670. And this is very barbaric. They actually distilled some ants. They took ants, heated them up, collected and condensed whatever was coming out. And they called it acid juice, spelled this way. And a couple of centuries later, this acid juice was identified as formic acid. And even before this was done, it was known that ant colonies actually kind of had a cloud of some acidic vapor on top of them, the ant colony. This was formic acid. And the ants use this in defense. Here's a poem by one of my favorite humorous poets. The ant has made himself illustrious by constant industry industrious. So what? Would you be calm and placid if you were full of formic acid? He's suggesting the ants are so busy because they have this noxious substance inside of them, and comparatively we're calmer. So formic acid is very closely related to acetic acid, which is vinegar. And there's an arachnid found in the south, and its spray contains acetic acid. And its spray smells like vinegar. So locally, this arachnid is called a vinegaroon, which I thought was an interesting name. Now, these are some birds engaging in a behavior called anting. Again, this is not rare. These two birds are actually spreading their wings over an ant colony. And this bird is actually taking ants in its beak and rubbing them on its wings, much like preening. And it's believed that the formic acid from the ants is helping it to get rid of external parasites. So I'm showing this in the context of animals like ants, producing their own toxin. But this is highly interesting in a different context, which I don't have time to go into, and that is the context of animals medicating themselves. And just last month, there was a book that came out called Doctors by Nature. If you're interested in this topic, please read it. More usually, it's like eating plants and leaves and that type of thing, which is not surprising. I mean, humans have obtained medicines from plants for thousands of years. And it's not surprising that animals might have discovered some of those same. Here are plant toxins, and a couple of interesting stories about plant toxins. In the Mojave Desert, this plant, this creosote bush, grows. It makes creosote, and creosote is a poison to animals. Creosote is, by the way, the stuff that accumulates in the chimney of your wood-burning fireplace. It's flammable, and that's the reason chimneys need to be cleaned. But it's toxic, and the wood rat, which lives also in the Mojave Desert, can eat this plant. And how does it do that? It has in its microbiome an enzyme that metabolizes and detoxifies the creosote. How does it get this enzyme? It actually eats feces of other wood rats and acquires that enzyme that helps it to detoxify the creosote. Now, in this way, it has created a little niche for itself. It has no competition for its food. It has the creosote bush all to itself. And this, of course, reminds us of the cellulose digesting bacteria in cows and in termites that are able to eat leaves and wood and so on. And this, by the way, I came across this in the context of the gene not being the only unit of inheritance and evolution. Here, you can say that the knowledge of eating the feces is going to give you that enzyme is probably learned, and that learning is passed on, and that's very much a part of inheritance that's not necessarily directly tied in to genetics. This is a spongy moth caterpillar, which is very destructive. It can defoliate aspen trees, as you can see here. But what happens is that when the new leaves come in response to this herbivory, in response to this loss of its leaves, it's now got 8 times more toxin in its leaves. Ironically, the spongy moth caterpillar is not affected by that 8 times more toxin, but 80% of the other insects in that ecosystem die off. So the spongy moth caterpillar goes scot-free. It's destroyed the plants, and it's also indirectly wreaked havoc on the ecosystem in general. Okay, so acquired toxins. So the monarch butterfly sequesters toxins from the milkweed plant it feeds on, and other insects do this also. They acquire toxins from their diet. This poison, it's no coincidence that these poisonous animals have bright coloration, danger coloration. This poison dart frog, I think you all know why these are called poison dart frogs. Indigenous people dip the tips of their darts in the poison when they go hunting to incapacitate the animal that they're hunting. Now these acquire, this and this bird, this was discovered not very long ago to be toxic, this pitoi from New Guinea. I think there are about a half dozen or so birds that are found to have toxins, and I think many of them live in New Guinea. This also acquires its toxin from eating insects, as does this. And interestingly, the insects, of course, acquire their toxin from plants, from the leaves that they eat. Now, if you keep this in captivity, a poison dart frog, and feed it insects that don't have the toxin, it will quickly lose its toxin. So it's very clear it depends on its diet. We don't have that much more, only a handful more slides. The blue-ringed octopus can change its color and take on this danger coloration. But what it does is it has toxin-producing bacteria that live in and around its salivary gland and is borrowing their toxins for itself. So I'm going to turn now for a couple of slides to pathogenic microorganisms that cause disease in humans and other animals. And the first one I'm going to talk about is a disease called toxoplasmosis. And on this slide, I have two examples of parasites that change the behavior of the host in such a way that it's easier for that parasite to be transmitted to the next host. And toxoplasmosis in mice causes the mice to be less afraid of cats. So they're more likely to be eaten by cats, and the cat happens to be the next host of this parasite, single cell parasite. And in this experiment, they had uninfected and infected mice, and they had the freedom to move into these compartments. And the infected mice spent more time in the compartment that had bobcat urine compared with these other compartments, and not the case with the control uninfected animals. So, parasites will cause perhaps some non-specific behavioral changes. And researchers have to distinguish between such non-specific behavioral changes from behavioral changes that are actually helping the parasite. And those are the ones that will be selected for through evolution. So I was talking to Eric last summer. I happened to mention that in this program, this was going to be one of my topics. And he said, "Oh, like rabies." And rabies is a good example, and I've included it here. Rabies virus can cause animals to become bold and ferocious and make them more readily bite other animals. They also cannot swallow their saliva, and the virus is transmitted through the saliva, through the bite. And there are actually many examples of parasites changing host behavior. And as I said, you have to be careful to distinguish between some non-specific behavioral changes from specific ones. Now, here is a parasite that changes not so much the behavior, but the gross anatomy of its host. This is the parasite, is a tongue-eating louse. It makes its way into fish through the gills, makes its way into the mouth, bites off the blood supply to the tongue, and takes the place of the tongue. For those of you with a sensitive stomach, I would say close your eyes. And then it proceeds to eat whatever it wants once it's there. Now, this was an award-winning photo, and it shows 3 clownfish. It's very hard to see, but each of those fish actually has a cymothoa in its mouth, and it speaks to the prevalence of that crustacean, of that louse, at least in that particular ecosystem. In one frame, you've captured 3 fish, all of which have the cymothoa. Okay, so I'm going to talk about bacteria and viruses, which in a broad sense are also parasites. And we know that the immune system and medications keep these infections under control. And the trick that they have that I want to talk about is developing resistance to both to the immune response and to medications. And what's really incredible is that the state of the science is such. This is an HIV virus enzyme. And this is a drug that binds to it and stops the virus from replicating. These are the mutations that can arise that make that drug bind less well to that protein, not all at the same time, but in different proteins. We understand literally and in atomic detail what are the mutations and how they prevent this drug from binding and how resistance arises. So that's the trick they have. It's an evolutionary trick. You're selecting for these mutants that are present, but they're selected for in the presence of the drug. Now, cancer cells, in a broad sense, can be considered to be parasitic. They grow at the expense of neighboring normal tissue and cells, and they too are kept in check by the immune system and by medications we develop, and they too can develop resistance to both of these. I think in this context, I'll talk about co-evolution and something called the evolutionary arms race. What happens is that when you have a pair, like the immune system, forget about medications for the moment, the immune system and these parasites, through evolution, through millions of years, or hundreds of thousands of years, they've been battling each other. The immune system comes up with an antibody against a surface antigen of one of these. Well, by mutation and through selection, you have a new population that has a different antigen on the surface. So the immune system is stymied for the time being, but it comes up with a newer antibody. And this is the arms race. And this is not restricted to this pair. Predators and prey are having this constant arms race. The brute parasite, the brown-headed cowbird, and the hosts are also doing this. The hosts are getting smarter at detecting, the tricks of the cuckoo, the brown-headed cowbird. The brown-headed cowbird is getting smarter to overcome those tricks. Of course, this can't go on indefinitely. At some point, something will become extinct or will not have the resources anymore, the energy resources, to continue to do this. But it's called the evolutionary arms race. This is actually my last slide, but I do want to show you one more slide, if it's okay. So I'm sorry, this is really wordy, and I'm attempting to answer, probably very unsuccessfully, whether animals know what they're doing when they're practicing deception. And one way to look at this is that this kind of behavior is instinctive and therefore not conscious behavior. But what if it is conscious behavior in some animals? In which animals is it likely to be conscious behavior? Sentient animals are believed to have some sort of a consciousness, and all these things, including emotions of some sort, intelligence, and so all vertebrates are supposed to be sentient animals. Among invertebrates, the octopus is very intelligent and is believed to be sentient. And we also know that the octopus changes its color in real time based on its substrate, what it's sitting on. So that could be one aspect of its intelligence, and it's possible that it knows what it's doing. Now there's another invertebrate that is believed to be sentient. And I have it here, right here. It's another invertebrate. Would anybody care to guess what it is? Just a wild guess. Worm? No. It's actually a lobster. It's a decapod. And decapods are believed to be sentient animals. And here's how this is relevant. In the UK, which has broader animal protections and animal rights laws, lobsters are protected under animal welfare laws. Not in the US, but in the UK. It's actually illegal in the UK to boil a live lobster. Enforcing that, another story, but on paper, lobsters are protected. I was going to end here, but I'm going to show you, I think, one more slide. Deception by humans. This is just for the sake of completeness. I don't intend to go into any detail in this. It raises all kinds of questions. Is it your genes? Is it your upbringing? Or both? Do we have free will? Do we know that we're doing good and evil? Or do we not have free will? And I will stop here and I will try to, I'll go back to a nicer slide. I will try to answer any questions. And thank you for your attention. Scott?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one other example relevant to our Firefly Festival. I think many of us are familiar with the Photinus genus, the local common firefly. There's a larger firefly called a Photurus that's capable, the female is capable of mimicking the flash pattern of the Photinus, and they lure the males in and then kill them. So,
yeah,
another visual deception.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think if you look hard enough, you'll find that most animals, whether it's subtle or more overt, more elaborate, have some tricks or another. Take all of birds, for example. The male birds, in most cases, females in some, are using some trick or the other to find a mate. Yes, Eric?
Should I just point out when you're talking about what other animals have consciousness or awareness, that depends, I think, on how you define intelligence and problem solving and all that sort of thing. But I remember from Ed Young's book, An Immense World, where he talks about ticks, that they sense their prey using infrared heat, and that a tick can be 15 feet away from you. And think about how long a distance that is for this little tiny animal, 15 feet away.
Yeah.
And it zooms in on your heat and starts moving towards you. You're not even aware of it because it's so small. So then you have to ask yourself, is that tick aware? Sure, it's aware of its food. Just like if I head towards an apple tree because I want to take an apple, I'm aware of that food. And it's problem solving, so does it do it by instinct? Do I go for the apple in the apple tree out of instinct? Or is it because I'm problem solving, I am intelligent, I'm aware? I think my own belief is that many parts of the animal world have intelligence, have awareness, have consciousness, because consciousness is not something that instantly involved with human beings. Consciousness, awareness, intelligence, problem solving has an evolutionary history, just like eyesight does. Eyesight comes about during the Paleozoic era in things like trilobites and so on. So it has a long history of development of sight. And I think consciousness, awareness, intelligence.
I completely agree. And that's why I say at a minimum, because I think it'll be expanding as we do more studies, as we understand more which animals are conscious. Now, 20 years ago, I don't think anybody would have believed that lobsters will be one day protected by animal welfare laws. But that's the reality now. So I completely agree with you. I think we should keep an open mind as to what constitutes intelligence, first of all, or consciousness. Jane, you had a question?
And the ones that sequester the toxins and so forth, how do they do that? Is it physical structure or?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Okay. In the animals that sequester the toxins or the poisons, how do they do that? Is it a physical structure or what? Chemical?
Eric might know about how monarchs sequester, but I think you're right, it's either physical sequestration or it's biochemical degradation and detoxification. I think possibly some animals can do either. This is a tobacco hornworm, and feeds on tobacco leaves. I believe this can do both. It detoxifies some, and it stores some nicotine as a defense against its predators, which could be butterflies or moths or whatever. Eric.
So I'll jump, instead of using the monarch as an example, I'll use the amanita mushroom, the one that's red and it's deadly poisonous, sometimes called fly agaric. It has like a pizza, on top of the red. And in Europe, it has been used by indigenous cultures like the Sami people of Norway, Sweden, Finland, as a hallucinogenic. It won't usually kill you, depending on how much you eat, but it'll give you one heck of a trip. And it doesn't get sequestered in your body. It passes through into your urine. The active ingredient that causes the hallucinogen passes into your urine and then is excreted. And I've read in different places that people who wanted to participate in the trip of the shaman, because the shaman would take and eat the amanita and get the trip, the hallucinogenic trip.
Mm-hmm.
But then the active ingredient passes into the shaman's urine. And during the party, other people would drink the shaman's urine, which led to the term "to get pissed."
Okay.
Seriously, that may very well be where the term "to get pissed" comes from.
But also to Jane's question, the poison dart frog, for example, it gets its toxins from insects, but pretty much I think it remains on its skin once it takes it in.
So the toxins can become sequestered in different parts of the body. In the case of the monarch adult butterfly, the toxins are sequestered in the exoskeleton, not in the urine.
But the other possibility is that it could be enzymatically detoxified. It doesn't happen in the case of the monarch. Okay, thank you all for your attention.